Contractors will absolutely become clients in the future. Same with perm candidates. It's all about longevity and growing your network because you never know who's going to become a decision maker down the line. And, they might come calling in a few months to a few years' time being like, hey, I really need some staffing help. Ultimately, contractors and candidates in general are your brand on the front lines.
Initiating becoming a hiring machine sequence in 3, 2, 1.
Hey everyone, it's Lex Winship and welcome to Becoming a Hiring Machine. This is the show dedicated to fixing recruitment by going beyond saying what needs to change and instead teaches you how to make the change. Today we have an amazing trending topics episode ahead of us, but before we get into that, I want to tell you a little bit about the show. Essentially, we have shows within the show. Sometimes we have interviews with industry thought leaders and others who are shaking up the space. And other times, like today, we cover trending topics. Every Tuesday, we drop a Tactical Tuesday episode where we go deep on how to do something that will help drive better results in your day-to-day. And occasionally, on special days, you'll hear a mic drop episode from Loxo's founder, Matt, where he shares something that he's been thinking about within the recruitment space and wants you to know. As a reminder, if you like the content that we share here, be sure to like, follow, subscribe, do your thing, and you will see us in all of your favorite listening or watching platforms. So today, we are on part 2 of a 3-part series on contract recruitment. Last time, we talked about the high-level benefits of the model, some industries that are primed for a shift, and some of the technology that can help make contract recruitment a little bit easier. Today, we are going to get a bit more specific and also logistical, exploring how to structure contracts, the pros and cons of contract to hire versus typical 1099 contracts, and beyond. So joining us again for this conversation is our internal Loxo expert on all things contract recruitment, Reegan Coleman. Welcome back.
Thanks, Lex. I'm happy to be back. For those that might not have listened to the first episode of this series just yet, or maybe they're new to the pod, my name is Reegan. I'm a strategic account manager here at Loxo. Prior to joining Loxo, I was actually in contract recruitment myself. I specialized in accounting and finance recruitment. So just excited to be back, excited to dig a little bit more into this topic in today's segment.
Awesome. Well, we are glad to have you here. And I think for anyone who listened to our first episode, we obviously kept it at kind of a high level. We started talking just at that like 3,000 or 30,000 foot view of contract recruitment. So today, I really want you to just kind of help us dive a little bit deeper into the more practical side of things. What does it actually look like to start dipping your toes in the world of contract recruitment? And we'll start with something that sounds maybe a little bit boring and technical at first, but I think that you're going to be able to share some good nuggets of wisdom with us. And that is on just like structuring contracts in general. I think that that can be something that feels a little bit scary and overwhelming to someone who has been very familiar with a typical model of work and then starting to think through like, okay, how do I really set myself up for success in this contract recruitment world? So walk us through, structuring contracts.
Yeah, absolutely. So first and foremost, I am by no means an expert. For legal reasons.
Disclaimer.
Consult your contract or legal team, not me. But these are just some of the best practices or tips that I've picked up along the way. So I think first things first, when it comes to thinking about structuring an agreement with a potential client, you definitely want to take into consideration the burden and the insurance aspects that you would be basically responsible for as that staffing agency, right? So one of the things we had talked about last time is one of the pros of contract recruitment or working with a staffing agency is because they take on some of those overhead costs, right? So things that are associated with like tax, payroll, legal compliance, basically they're handling that for you for the contract workers, right? So as a staffing company, you really want to make sure that the bill rates are factoring in the cost or the burden of those administrative functions that you're taking on. Again, that insurance, that Social Security, the different taxes that are involved. So that way, when a candidate's pay rate and then that burden are deducted from the bill rate, the leftover or your margin, as we call it in contract recruitment, is still a significant amount. For most companies, that margin is also what determines commission, whether that's on the sales side or the recruiting side. So the better off the profit is for the company, the more overall money you're going to have as a recruiter, as a salesperson to be taking home.
What's good for the goose is good for the gander. Is that what they
Exactly.
say?
Exactly. Yeah. Absolutely. So yeah, thinking through your burden rates is a big thing. The other thing to keep in mind is kind of thinking through a potential conversion fee or perhaps like a minimum contracted period. Another thing that we talked about in last episode is how one of the many, many positives of contract recruitment is that it could technically be your permanent solution, meaning that that contractor that you hire for maybe a short-term project could ultimately be someone as an employer that you want to hire on full-time as, like, again, the solution, right? Now, as a recruiter or as a salesperson, you need to be thinking through, well, I had this person and I thought they were going to be out there for 6-12 months, right? So I was banking on that margin, on that commission. But now my client is coming to me being like, hey, I'm over the moon with this person. I really want to hire them. It's great, right? But what happens to that margin or that commission that you're making? So you want to factor in a conversion fee of set amount to kind of basically buy out the rest of the contract, or on the flip side, enforce a minimum amount of time that someone has to be in the contract before you guys can start thinking about a potential conversion. So that's another tip for the trade that I would definitely
Very interesting. So are you saying basically like before you kind of, when you're structuring the contract, you have to think through that long-term approach of like, this person might end up being hired full-time. So we need to kind of build the contract in a way that would support that eventuality?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, again, some agreements are going to be specifically contract. Like there are some cases where you're probably not going to ever really engage. It could be, because of the hiring forecast for the company, or maybe the role or the project doesn't call for that long term. But yes, if there's a shadow of a doubt or some sort of opportunity that it could become a permanent role, it's definitely a conversation that you should be having ahead of time with your client when you're structuring that agreement.
So this is a bit of a pivot potentially, but I'm curious, in a conversation like that or in a situation in which the client is like, hey, we are obsessed with this person. We want to hire them full time. You as the recruiter who brought that person into the mix, are you then having continued conversations with the candidate as well to kind of see how this fit is working out for them? What are they interested in? Or are you kind of just engaging with the client at that point? Where do you fit into the mix as that like middleman role in this almost conversion scenario?
Yeah. So I think that's going to depend on how every recruiting company structures their internal organization, right? But in my personal experience, I was always the middleman.
Okay.
It was me chatting with my client and me chatting with my candidate. And something that we'll talk about further along in this episode is just like the operations of like the contractor to client side, right? But each recruiter should be already in the habit of checking in with their candidate or their contractor, I guess, on a regular basis. So you should probably already have a pulse on what's going on. It's then more so for the client to come to you and have those official conversations. Sometimes it does happen where the client goes to the contractor and is like, hey, we would really like to do this. So again, just all the more reason to have a pulse on what's going on. But ultimately then, yes, technically as the recruiter or as the salesperson, whatever your role is in the middle is to structure and kind of navigate those conversations at that time.
Okay, interesting. So anything else you want to share about just kind of high level structuring contracts before we move into the next phase of the conversation?
Yeah, I think the only other thing outside of like conversion fee or like the minimum contracted period is potentially non-solicitation clause. That's a tongue twister. I typically see this anywhere from like 6 to 12 months, but this same thing is like a non-solicitation for an employee, right? Where you're not really, and I see this on the sales side where it's like, okay, you're not allowed to really go after these clients, right? If they're a client of a business that you previously worked for. I think it's the same mentality here where it would basically prevent your client the company that the contractor would be working for from like directly hiring them without compensating you, the staffing agency.
Okay. Yeah, that seems pretty important. Just kind of cover that base in case. Hopefully, this is something where everyone, can trust each other, but it's good to kind of cover those bases, I'm sure.
Yeah. And again, not a legal expert by any means.
No.
But
Consult your lawyer if you have one, and let's talk to them. We're giving advice, not anything that would hold up in court. So please take this all and use it to your knowledge benefit. But if you're going to seriously start considering contract recruitment as an avenue for your business, please consult a legal expert. And we are not legal experts. We will make that abundantly clear.
I love it.
Okay, so I'm curious about just some of the different contracts that commonly come up, or different ways or methods that contract recruitment might work out. I know, obviously, the ones that I hear about all the time. I've been a 1099 employee for various companies as I have done freelance work. So what are the other options for candidates, and also for just like, recruiters who want to get into this model?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you have like your contract, or like contract to hire W-2s, or you have your 1099 contractors. It really depends. I've seen staffing agencies work both, right? Where it's you have a W-2 or you have a 1099. It just depends on the job. I've seen some staffing agencies where they will only work W-2s. I think it really just depends on your preference on the client side. It also depends on your preference as a candidate as well, right? Like, what kind of role do you want to work? From a high level, I think there's pros and cons of both. Independent contracting, or your 1099 mentality, you typically have higher earning potential because, again, like, that burden is not necessarily something that you're having to worry about, right? You're setting your own rates. You're typically earning more on an hourly basis because, again, no benefits, no employment taxes, that kind of thing. However, you then have to make sure that you're setting money aside in the future so that you can pay those taxes down the line.
It's always fun, tax season as a 1099. Yeah.
I've never done it. I don't know if I could do it. Like, I'm an organized person. I don't know if I'm that organized.
You need an accountant, honestly. That's the recommendation that I would give to anyone who's looking into becoming an independent contractor. You need an accountant. It's hard to manage all of that stuff on your own. And there are so many ins and outs and little intricacies that you can't really plan for. So hire an accountant and a lawyer. We're going to just push you in the direction of hiring all these experts.
Literally. Yeah. So definitely a pro and a con, right? Whereas with a W-2, you might have a little bit of a lower earning potential, but you have insurance. You have the taxes that are already being taken out or handled for you by your staffing agency. So I think
question on that front too then, and this is maybe a bit too in the weeds logistically, but I'm curious, as a recruiter, as a contract recruiter, are you ever working on placements where this candidate is working for two different companies at the same time, and you are kind of managing that, and kind of like, how does that factor into the mix? I'm curious.
I think the only time I've ever done that is with part-time contracts.
Okay.
Yeah, I had a couple contractors. It was like a specialized administrative position that we had a couple openings for. So I was able to fill, they already had a part-time job, and then this worked out with our role that we were hiring for. But I would say if you're going to be looking to diversify your income streams or have multiple clients at one time, the 1099 route is going to be better suited because you have more autonomy over your schedule, more autonomy over what clients or projects that you're working on. Whereas with the W-2 contract that's preset, it's usually going to be full-time, and because of labor laws, you're probably only going to be working a 40-hour-a-week job, right? So yeah, I think part-time is really the only time I've seen it or done it.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, so we got into this conversation a little bit in the first episode, but I want to revisit it now that we've kind of set some of this practical guardrails to this conversation. So we talked a little bit about this long game approach where candidates can become clients within this contract recruitment world. So I'm just fascinated by this mentality of almost like thinking 12 steps ahead as you're taking that first step. Can you just walk me through that a little bit more here in terms of how you manage that long game?
Yeah, absolutely. I think to start, contractors will absolutely become clients in the future. Same with perm candidates. It's all about longevity and growing your network because you never know who's going to become a decision maker down the line. And, they might come calling in a few months to a few years' time, being like, hey, I really need some staffing help. Ultimately, contractors and candidates in general are your brand on the front lines. Every contract worker you place is a direct reflection of your agency's reputation. If they perform well, that reflects back on you, and the client comes back to you with increased roles. So, again, just opening doors to more business. And then if they don't perform well, you risk losing the account altogether. So the takeaway is make sure that you're treating your contract workers like brand ambassadors because they really are.
I love that as someone who lives in the brand world. We talk about this all the time. Your employees at a company are brand ambassadors. These are people who are getting the message of your brand, your company, your mission out there. And oftentimes they're the public face of the brand in a way that, you have your founders, you have these kind of talking heads, but the grassroots, boots on the ground people are often the ones having so much more of an impact on people's perception of your brand. And so I love, love, love the idea of encouraging recruiters to think through this in the same way. It creates a bit more pressure, but it also creates a bit more accountability on every single placement of like, hey, this is sending a message about the caliber of candidates I'm bringing to the table, the level of talent and quality that I'm married to and unwilling to divorce myself from. I don't know why I'm using these marriage and divorce analogies so much, but I do think that it is really important. And if you think through every single move you make with that in mind, it just forces you to have a commitment to quality that I think a lot of people almost allow themselves to take it a little bit too easy sometimes and say, it's just one here, it's just one there. And it's like, no, all of this is adding up to your perception and your reputation. And that's something that's really, really, really difficult to regain once it's been lost.
Yes, I 100% agree. I think not only on like the client side, right, of generating recurring business, it's also important on the contractor side because contractors have friends, they have family, they have people in their network that they also know. And so the happier they are with the experience and the more they trust you as a recruiter, as an extension of themselves, the more likely they are to extend that same thing to other people in their network, right? Of like, hey, you should really go work with Lex. She's incredible. That kind of thing. So I just think it's very important to treat everybody as this is the next opportunity because you truly never know what door that's going to open, what window that's going to open, just that kind of thing. So
no, I think it's such a good point. And one thing I just want to kind of reiterate is the bar is actually pretty low here too. This is a conversation that we have so often, and I've done a ton of digging on data that supports this. You'd be so surprised at how many people are just like, I just want a single response after an interview. Like people who get so far in the interview process and then never hear another word. It's not, in 2025, you would think that we wouldn't be having this conversation of stop ghosting candidates, but it is still happening time and time again. And so I think that this is just, a big moment where clear communication can make such a big difference. That kindness and like just showing human decency. This is a great use case for automation. It sounds almost like an oxymoron that automation and AI can help you be more human, but it does give you the opportunity to just create these moments where you're really communicating and even over communicating sometimes. And that I think sets such a precedent of, hey, I am committed to you and to this relationship, and I'm willing to make the time and put in the effort to make sure that you feel supported and that you feel like you have all the information. Those little things can go such a long way in building that long-term relationship and really cultivating trust, which again is hard to come by, easy to lose, and then almost impossible to win back. And so I think having that mentality here in any model of recruitment is so important, but I can see how in contract specifically, it's really, really critical.
That is such a good point that you bring up, Lex. Like, unfortunately, we are still in a day and age where there are far too many candidates that are basically getting left on red, right? They're being ghosted, like you said. And one of the things that we touched on last time is contract staffing is inherently just really high volume. That's not going to change. That's not going to go away. I think the problem that a lot of recruiters face is it's not that they don't care to get back to a candidate, it's that they might not necessarily have time. And I'm not using that as an excuse, because I do agree, like, human decency, that human touch is super, super important. But to your point, the automation and some of the administrative tasks that you can cut down on using AI is huge. Humble brag, humble plug for Loxo, but we do have like an email automation tool that you can attach to a job stage. I think typically I'm recommending to my clients to do like, a thank you for applying automated email when their application comes in, or, sometimes for high volume staffing like this, an automated rejection email, trying to make it feel human, right? But also at the end of the day, it's an automated email. But I think some news is better than no news.
Yeah.
So
That's what we've heard.
Yeah.
There's so many surveys that, again, time and time again, candidates say, I just want to know. I just want to know what I'm working with here. And I think, like, yes, this is one of the biggest arguments for automation in general is like, yeah, like you said, it's not a lack of care. It's a lack of time. There's so many other things that are happening at any given moment, and especially in a high volume setting. You've almost got to use automation. It's one of the biggest things that I think, you can start to leverage to make these interactions feel a little bit more human. I'm curious in general, would you say then that contractors are ghosted more frequently than perm?
Oh, wow.
Just because of how high volume it is? I'm just wondering.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I am going to say yes. I think that contract candidates or like lifetime contractors are probably ghosted more than perm candidates, but there are far too many perm candidates that are still being ghosted left and right. But yeah, I think because of the nature of how, and also not to say that contractors are applying like crazy to different positions, but because of how fast things move, if you're not applying and you're not being seen pretty quickly, your chances for the job are lessening. So you're probably applying to more positions, hearing back about less positions. So long-winded way of saying, yeah, probably.
Okay. No, I figured that makes sense, but I think anytime there's a gap, there's an opportunity. And I think here, again, the bar is low. There are so many opportunities where if you're in contract recruitment, if you are the contract recruiter who is the most communicative and the most responsive, you've instantly set yourself apart and instantly made such a positive impression. And I think that, again, that's something that use AI, use automation to your advantage, and build workflows that support the volume that you're working with. I think that is, such a great opportunity. And I'm excited and curious to see how people start to adapt to this and start to use these tools to their advantage. And this is, again, not a subtle plug for Loxo, but more so if you have stories about you leveraging automation to make your entire interviewing and hiring process more human, I'm always interested in hearing those stories. So please message us at podcast@loxo.co. I would love to hear your story and use it as data in anecdotal data in these conversations.
Absolutely.
So back on track, keep telling me a little bit more about the long game here when it comes to contract recruitment.
Yeah, I think just to kind of stem off of that conversation that we were having about, referrals from families and friends, that kind of thing, a happy contractor is more likely to stay on longer, right? They might extend their contract. Again, those referrals, it ultimately is growing your book without like an added sourcing cost from that perspective. Contract workers, yes, they're people. I'm going to say that. But inherently, they're also a living revenue stream, right? When you think about it from a business perspective, churn kills your margins, which kills your commission, which means you're not walking home with as much money as you could be making. Ultimately, someone has to be in the seat for the recruiter to be paid, right? So I think kind of what I touched on earlier in this episode is that the most successful recruiters are in the habit of checking in with their contractors regularly. I think some of the best plays that I've seen are, their contractors have them on speed dial and they know, hey, every Thursday at 2 p.m. I'm going to call my recruiter and be like, hey, this is what's going on. They do like a 5-minute check-in call. You good? Great. Move on. Right? So that weekly check-in is crucial. I think also from a contractor or candidate standpoint, it's so important to know that you have that time to chat with your representative because, yes, they're your recruiter, but they're an extension of you when it comes to the client-facing mentality. Sometimes as a contractor, because you're kind of in that halfway point, right? I'm working for you, but I'm not your full-time employee. You feel like you need someone that would be able to advocate for you. So that recruiter or that representative, right, being able to do that and address any issues directly on your behalf is also so important to be able to keep the pulse on what's going on the client side and on the candidate side. Ultimately, just the proactive support is going to keep them on assignment and keep them on your books and make sure your margins are good. So
Keep them happy.
keep them happy and they'll stay engaged. That's really, really what it is.
I mean, I think that makes so much sense just in terms of employee engagement in general too. This is just tried and true advice that you can apply across the board. Keep them happy and they'll stay.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. I think another thing that we can talk about here is like on that retention piece, right, is protecting your profit. I know we've really touched on margins a lot in this conversation. I think it's crucial to...
They're important.
Exactly. They are. Margins, okay? But the other thing to think about is backfilling contractors is also costing you time and money. So like what we talked about last time from an employer or a client side, you're really benefiting because you're not taking on those burdens. But as a staffing agency, you are. Ultimately, an early exit or a termination or something like that, it basically means, hey, you're going to have to put in some free work to fix the issue as the recruiter. I have to backfill this position. So again, engaged and supported workers, fewer costly replacements. So attention now saves your margins later.
Okay, this is maybe a dumb question, but when it comes to an early exit or something like that, what role does the recruiter play in that scenario?
Yeah, again, I kind of think it depends, but
Okay.
Not necessarily depends. In all of the companies that I've worked for, if there's been a backfill or someone that's fallen off, it's typically not necessarily the recruiter that placed that person. It's not their responsibility to backfill the role. It'll then get opened back up to the team,
Okay.
like the contract staffing team, to try to fill it. So, I think you want to keep someone in because it's hard, first of all, to get a head count. To build your head count and make sure that you're making that and generating that commission is hard. So then when it falls off and then maybe you lose that placement to someone else internally or another staffing agency, like you never want to see that. You never want your head count to go down.
No. Margins.
Yes, literally.
Don't forget it.
Don't.
Okay, so anything else before we wrap that feels relevant to this very practical conversation on contract recruitment?
Yeah, I think just ultimately setting yourself up for success from jump, right, with your agreements, just thinking through how can I structure this so that it's mutually beneficial, and ultimately I'm going to be able to obtain the most success that I can down the line. And then also making sure that once you have that agreement in place, you're ready, you're starting to work those roles, you are actively engaging, supporting, and managing the candidates and contractors that you're working with. This is going to deliver better results for you, for the client, for the contractor, and it's also going to protect your revenue, your margins, and your reputation overall.
Okay, I love it. What is it? I think we should replace happy wife, happy life with happy contractors, happy life. I'll put that on a t-shirt.
Happy contractors, happy margins.
Happy margins. Okay, I like it. I'm developing this as we speak.
I love it.
Well, thank you for joining us. Appreciate it. So glad that we have had this conversation, the last one, and we still have one more to go. Part 3 coming soon. So stay tuned. Thanks, Reegan, for joining us. Really appreciate you.
Thanks for having me.
So here we go. We'll wrap it up. Becoming a Hiring Machine is a production of Loxo. If you liked this episode and are not sure where to go next, we have a whole bunch of fantastic episodes, but in this case specifically, we'll want to refer you to the last episode, part 1 that we did on contract recruitment, and the one coming up. So we'll be sure to link those in the show notes so that you can follow along. You can find those show notes in the description of your favorite podcast streaming platform, as well as on our website at loxo.co/podcasts. Full episodes are available on YouTube as well as on our website if you're more of a visual person like me. If you have a specific question, are looking for advice, or want to share a story like I mentioned before, you can send us an email at podcast@loxo.co. I read every email that comes through and respond to every single one. No automation. I do it myself. So please send an email. I would love to hear from you and maybe even chat with you on the pod, or at least bring up some of these questions that you're raising on the podcast. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to leave us a quick rating in your podcast streaming platform. It only takes 3 seconds, but it helps us understand what kind of content you guys love, and it also helps other recruiters find us. All right, everyone, that is the show. Until next time.